The 1970s produced some of the most memorable rock songs ever recorded. Songs that came out of nowhere, hit enormous, and then were never followed by anything close to the same impact. Here are 12 rock one-hit wonders from the 1970s baby boomers we'll never forget. Number 12, Ride, Captain, Ride by Blues Image. Blues Image was a Florida rock band who released Ride, Captain, Ride in 1970, and it reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song has one of the most immediately recognizable organ introductions in early 1970s rock radio. A rolling, expansive keyboard figure that sets up a driving, optimistic rock track about leaving the past behind and heading somewhere new with 63 people willing to make the journey alongside you. The lyrics were written by Frank Conte and Mike Panera, and the combination of that organ hook with the song's straightforward emotional message about freedom, possibility, and fresh starts made it a staple of AM radio during the summer of 1970, a year when the rock audience was looking for something that felt open and forward-moving after the heaviness of the late 1960s had settled into the culture. Blues Image had been part of the late 1960s rock scene in Los Angeles and had built their sound playing clubs and touring before Ride, Captain, Ride gave them their commercial breakthrough. The success of the single did not translate into sustained mainstream attention for the band, and they disbanded without producing another hit of comparable reach. Guitarist Mike Panera later joined Iron Butterfly, connecting him to another piece of early 1970s rock history, while the rest of the band went separate directions. Ride, Captain, Ride has remained in classic rock compilation rotation for decades, appearing consistently on collections of early 1970s radio hits and giving the song a commercial afterlife that its creators could not have anticipated in 1970. Many younger listeners who encounter it today have no idea it was the only significant commercial moment for the band that recorded it. For baby boomers who heard it on AM radio during the summer of 1970, it is one of the most vivid sonic memories of that very specific period. That organ introduction arriving through a car radio on a hot afternoon, and the feeling of the whole summer stretching out in front of you with no particular destination required. Number 11, Hocus Pocus by Focus. Focus was a Dutch progressive rock band led by guitarist Jan Akkerman and vocalist and flautist Thijs van Leer, and their 1973 recording of Hocus Pocus is one of the most genuinely unusual songs to reach the American top 20 during that decade. The track combines hard rock guitar with jazz improvisation, classical influences, yodeling, whistling, scatting, and extended instrumental passages in a way that defied any easy categorization by radio programmers, which makes its commercial success. It reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100, all the more remarkable. There was nothing else on American radio in 1973 that sounded remotely like it. Focus had been releasing albums in the Netherlands since 1970, and were a well-established act in the European progressive rock scene before Hocus Pocus crossed over into American radio. In the United States, however, the band remained almost entirely associated with that one track, which received substantial FM airplay without translating into any broader American following for their larger body of work. Thijs van Leer's extended yodeling vocal performance in the middle of a hard rock arrangement struck American listeners as genuinely unexpected, and the combination of technical virtuosity with deliberate absurdity gave the song a quality that made it instantly memorable in a way that few songs of any era achieve. Baby boomers who heard it on FM radio in 1973 remember it precisely because nothing else in their listening experience prepared them for what they were hearing. And that element of genuine surprise is what makes certain one-hit wonders stick in the memory far longer than more polished and predictable records. Number 10, Wildfire by Michael Martin Murphey. Michael Martin Murphey released Wildfire in 1975, and it reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming one of the most unexpected crossover hits of that year. Murphy was primarily a country and folk songwriter who had written songs for other artists and recorded his own albums for a regional audience before Wildfire brought him to the attention of the mainstream rock and pop radio market. The song tells the story of a girl who died in a blizzard searching for her horse, and whose ghost now rides through storms calling for a living man to follow her into the beyond. A premise that is essentially a ghost story wrapped in a love song, delivered with complete and unwavering emotional sincerity. The arrangement was built around acoustic guitar, lush orchestration, and Murphy's warm, unhurried vocal delivery, and it stood out against the harder-edged rock and increasingly synthesizer-driven pop that was competing for radio space in 1975. It connected with listeners who wanted something more atmospheric and narrative from their rock radio than the prevailing formats were offering. Murphy continued recording throughout the 1970s and built a long career in cowboy and western music in subsequent decades, but he never approached the mainstream crossover success of Wildfire again with a rock or pop audience. For the baby boomers who heard it that summer on the radio, Wildfire occupies a very specific place in the memory. It was haunting in a way that few pop songs of that era managed, and its subject matter was strange enough that once heard, it was essentially impossible to forget.
She went calling wild.
Number 9. Spirit in the Sky by Norman Greenbaum. Norman Greenbaum released Spirit in the Sky in late 1969, and it became a substantial commercial hit in early 1970, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and eventually selling over 2 million copies in the United States. Greenbaum was a Jewish singer-songwriter from Malden, Massachusetts, who had previously recorded with a jug band called Dr. West's Medicine Show and Junk Band before pursuing a solo career. He built the distinctive fuzz guitar sound that drives the track himself by modifying his instrument, and the result was a tone that was heavy, rough, and insistent in a way that stood apart from most of what was on the radio in early 1970. The combination of that heavy fuzz guitar with explicitly Christian religious lyrics, direct, unambiguous references to heaven, salvation, and a personal connection to Jesus, produced something that had no real precedent in mainstream rock music. Greenbaum has explained in interviews that he wrote it after watching a country gospel performance on television and wanting to capture that directness in a rock context, with no particular personal religious conviction driving the content. The song found a large audience among listeners who appreciated both its sonic texture and its emotional straightforwardness on the subject of the afterlife. Greenbaum never had another major commercial hit despite a long subsequent career in music. Spirit in the Sky has had an extraordinary long life through its repeated use in film soundtracks, television programs, and advertising across the 5 decades since its release. But for baby boomers who first heard it on radio in early 1970, it arrived as something genuinely new, a piece of rock and roll about going to heaven that sounded as though it meant every word. Number 8. Brandy, You're a Fine Girl by Looking Glass. Looking Glass released Brandy, You're a Fine Girl in 1972, and it reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The band was a New Jersey rock group formed at Rutgers University and led by singer and guitarist Elliot Lurie, who wrote and sang the song, and the recording featured a warm, organ-driven arrangement that gave it a nautical, tavern room quality that felt immediately lived in and specific. The song tells the story of a barmaid named Brandy, who is loved by the sailors who pass through her port town but is always left behind when the sea calls them back to where they belong. The emotional balance of the lyric, Brandy is admired and desired, but she is not enough to compete with the pull of the ocean, gave it a melancholy undertow that listeners found affecting beneath its warm, accessible surface. The success of Brandy brought Looking Glass significant radio attention and the kind of promotional momentum that record labels invest in when a song reaches the top of the national chart. None of it translated into a follow-up hit of comparable reach. The band released subsequent singles that found no real audience and eventually disbanded. Lurie built a successful career as a music supervisor and composer for film and television, working in an industry that would decades later continue using Brandy in projects that introduced it to younger listeners. The song has never left classic rock and oldies radio in the decades since its original release, and baby boomers who were in their teens and 20s in 1972 can almost certainly still sing every word of it today without needing any prompting. It is one of the clearest examples of how a single song can define an entire band's public identity so completely that nothing else the band ever did registers alongside it. Number 7, Radar Love by Golden Earring. Golden Earring was a Dutch rock band who had been recording since the mid-1960s and were well established in the Netherlands and parts of Western Europe before their 1973 recording of Radar Love crossed over into the American market in 1974, where it reached number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song became a substantial FM rock radio staple almost immediately, particularly in its full album-length version running over 6 minutes, which was perfectly suited to the album-oriented rock format that was reshaping American radio during that period and giving disc jockeys more freedom to play extended tracks than AM radio had ever allowed. The song's subject? A man driving through the night sustained by the telepathic connection he feels with the woman who is waiting for him, gave it an emotional premise that resonated strongly with listeners who understood the particular experience of the long road at night, and the production supported that feeling with a relentless rhythmic drive that never let up from beginning to end. The driving rhythm section, Barry Hayes' insistent lead vocal, and the song's carefully constructed forward momentum made it an immediate and durable classic rock radio fixture that has never really left rotation in the 5 decades since its release. Golden Earring remained a productive working band in Europe for decades after Radar Love, continuing to release new material and touring extensively before their original guitarist George Kooijmans's ALS diagnosis eventually brought the band to a close. In the United States, the band existed almost entirely in the public imagination through Radar Love, which is the classic one-hit wonder dynamic. Not a band that failed to produce other quality work, but a band whose American commercial visibility was concentrated entirely into a single, unforgettable radio moment. A second song, Twilight Zone, reached the American Top 20 in 1983, giving Golden Earring a rare decade-spanning dual presence in the American market. But for most American baby boomers, Radar Love is where the story begins and ends, and the opening synth figure and descending drum, Phil, that introduced the song trigger an immediate recognition response in anyone who was listening to FM rock radio during the mid-1970s. Number 6, Driver's Seat by Sniff and the Tears. Sniff and the Tears was a British band led by singer and guitarist Paul Roberts, and their 1978 recording of Driver's Seat reached number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1979, becoming one of the more unexpected crossover moments of the late 1970s American rock radio landscape. The song has a smooth, slightly detached, and atmospheric quality. Roberts' vocal delivery is cool and observational, and the production occupies a space between new wave and polished pop rock that gives it a slightly mysterious and elusive character. It was the kind of track that radio listeners responded to strongly without necessarily being able to categorize it, which gave it a particular quality of strangeness within the context of the surrounding radio landscape. Sniff and the Tears never achieved comparable American chart success with any subsequent release, and the band remained almost entirely unknown to the American public beyond Driver's Seat. They continued recording in the United Kingdom with a lower commercial profile through the following years, releasing albums that found small audiences without ever finding their way back onto American radio. Driver's Seat has appeared consistently on compilations of late 1970s one-hit wonders and forgotten radio hits, and the song has maintained a small but loyal following among listeners who remember its specific atmospheric quality as something that captured a very particular moment in late-decade rock radio. Baby boomers who remember 1979 recall Driver's Seat with a kind of quiet fondness. It sounds exactly like that specific moment in time and no other, the particular feeling of late-night FM radio in the final year of a decade, with the window cracked and the volume set just low enough to let the world outside filter in around the edges. Number 5, Float On by The Floaters. The Floaters released Float On in 1977, and it reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, spending over 20 weeks on the chart overall and becoming one of the more unusual soul-funk crossover hits of the late 1970s. The song is structured around each of the four group members, Charles Clark, Paul Mitchell, Ralph Mitchell, and Larry Cunningham, introducing himself by name and astrological sign before delivering his romantic message directly to the listener, which is a premise that reads as somewhat unusual on paper but worked with surprising effectiveness on radio, where listeners genuinely engage with the format and remember the individual introductions long after the song had finished its chart run. The Floaters were a Detroit group with a background in the soul and R&B tradition of that city, and Float On placed them briefly at the center of the mainstream pop crossover conversation in the summer of 1977. The Floaters never produced another hit of comparable chart reach, and their subsequent releases found very little traction with the mainstream audience that Float On had briefly delivered to them. The song sat at an unusual intersection of R&B, soul, and the smooth vocal group sound that was beginning to shade into what would later be called quiet storm radio, and it was distinct enough in its approach and concept to feel genuinely memorable to listeners encountering it for the first time in the summer of 1977. Baby boomers who remember that summer recall Float On as a very particular kind of cultural artifact, a song whose astrological premise was slightly absurd, whose execution was completely committed and entirely sincere, and whose catchiness was so absolute and inescapable that resistance was essentially futile once the song had played more than twice on your radio. The astrological introductions became a running joke among listeners, but even the people making the joke could recite each one in sequence from memory without any difficulty. Number 4, Shake Your Booty by KC and the Sunshine Band. KC and the Sunshine Band released Shake Your Booty in 1976, and it went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming one of the most recognizable dance hits of the disco era. Harry Wayne Casey and Richard Finch had built the Miami sound, a combination of funk rhythms, R&B horns, and pop accessibility that helped define disco for the American mainstream. And Shake Your Booty was one of the purest expressions of that formula. The band had multiple hits during the mid to late 1970s, so they were not a one-hit wonder in the strict commercial sense. But for baby boomers who remember the disco years, Shake Your Booty is the song that most completely captures the specific energy of that moment on the dance floor. The particular feeling of 1976 before the backlash arrived. The song's appeal was entirely physical and immediate. It did not ask anything of the listener except to move, and the production was constructed with that goal entirely in mind. Casey has spoken in interviews about the Miami recording sessions that produced the band's run of hits, describing a creative environment that was focused entirely on what would make people get up rather than sit down. For the baby boomer generation who were in their 20s during the peak disco years, Shake Your Booty belongs to a very specific category of memory. The songs that were so thoroughly embedded in a particular time and physical experience that hearing them today produces something closer to sense memory than nostalgia. Number 3, Magnet and Steel by Walter Egan. Walter Egan released Magnet and Steel in 1978, and it reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song was produced by Lindsey Buckingham and featured background vocals by Stevie Nicks, which gave it a sonic connection to the Fleetwood Mac sound that was dominating album-oriented rock radio at that specific moment in the decade. Rumors had been released in 1977 and was still generating enormous commercial energy throughout 1978. Egan had been part of the Los Angeles singer-songwriter scene during the mid-1970s and had connections within the Fleetwood Mac circle that led to the production collaboration. And the assistance he received gave Magnet and Steel a polish and accessibility that successfully crossed it from the singer-songwriter world into the rock radio mainstream. Egan never achieved another hit of comparable commercial reach, and Magnet and Steel has remained his sole moment of national radio visibility across a career that continued for decades. The song occupies an interesting and specific position in the late 1970s rock landscape. It is immediately recognizable to baby boomers who lived through that period. It sounds exactly and unmistakably like 1978, and yet the name of the artist behind it does not register in the public consciousness in the same way that the song itself does. Many people who can hum Magnet and Steel from start to finish without any hesitation would need a moment to name who actually recorded it, and some could not name him at all. That quality, a song more famous and more culturally persistent than its creator, perfectly calibrated to a specific moment in radio history, carrying the sonic signature of its year in every note, is the defining characteristic of the most enduring one-hit wonders. And Magnet and Steel fits the description as well as any record from the 1970s. Number 2, Fly Like an Eagle by Steve Miller Band.
I wanna fly like an eagle, let my spirit carry me.
Steve Miller Band released Fly Like an Eagle in 1977 from the album of the same name, and it reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song is built on a hypnotic, cycling synthesizer figure that repeats with the regularity of a mantra and Steve Miller's unhurried, meditative vocal delivery, and it captured a specific mood that sat distinctly apart from the harder-edged rock and the disco-dominated pop that surrounded it on radio in 1977. The Steve Miller Band had been recording since the late 1960s and had a substantial catalog that included a run of hit singles in the mid-1970s, so they were not a one-hit wonder in any biographical sense. But for a particular subset of baby boomer listeners, especially those who came to rock radio in the mid-1970s, rather than growing up with the band's earlier work, Fly Like an Eagle is the song that defined the Steve Miller Band most completely, the one that carries the most immediate and specific emotional charge.
Fly like an eagle to the sea.
Miller has described the song's creation as coming from a desire to write something spacious and unhurried, in deliberate contrast to much of what surrounded it on the radio during the same period. The synthesizer drone that opens the track and maintains its cycling presence throughout the song created a sense of floating, sustained movement that matched the lyrics' imagery of escape, aspiration, and the desire for a world that works more fairly and more kindly. Baby boomers who remember hearing it for the first time on FM radio in 1977 often describe the experience in similar terms. It sounded different from everything that came before and after it in the broadcast rotation, and that difference created an impression that has maintained itself through 5 decades of continuous radio presence and countless uses in films, commercials, and soundtrack compilations that have kept the song in circulation long after the decade that produced it has passed.
I wanna fly like an eagle, let my spirit carry me.
Number 1, More Than a Feeling by Boston. Boston released More Than a Feeling in 1976 as the lead single from their self-titled debut album, and it reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. The debut album went on to sell over 17 million copies in the United States alone, making it one of the best-selling debut albums in the history of American music. Tom Scholz, the band's guitarist and primary creative force, had spent years developing and recording the album's basic tracks in his basement studio in Massachusetts while working as a product designer at Polaroid, and the layered, polished guitar sound he achieved in that homemade studio became one of the most influential sonic signatures in late 1970s rock music. The opening guitar figure of More Than a Feeling is among the most immediately recognized in rock history, triggering an identification response in baby boomers who lived through that era before the first verse has finished. The song's combination of Scholz's meticulously constructed guitar layers, Brad Delp's soaring lead vocal, and the emotional directness of the lyric, about a moment of music-induced memory, a song leading the narrator back to someone who is no longer there, gave it a quality that connected with listeners on a genuinely emotional level, rather than simply a sonic one. Boston continued releasing albums and charting through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, but More Than a Feeling remains the song that defines what the band meant and means to the generation that first heard it in 1976. For baby boomers, it is not simply a one-hit wonder in the traditional sense. It is a record whose opening notes carry an entire moment of their lives, compressed into something that plays out in under 5 minutes every time the song comes through a speaker. If those opening guitar notes just played themselves in your head, without any assistance from a radio or a playlist, you know exactly why these songs have never left. The 1970s was a decade that knew how to make something you could not put down. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.